Beneath a sky stretched thin with heat and silence, mercy was rarer than rain. The land was made of jagged stone and broken promises, and for those unlucky enough to be left behind, it was a graveyard without markers. She felt the rawhide bite. Her wrists before the laughter of the men even faded into the distance. They had tied her high against the arm of a saguaro cactus, the spines digging into her back with every shallow breath. The heat was already rising, though dawn had barely split the horizon. A sky of fire was coming, and she was lashed to the desert's cruelest altar. Her name was Clara Dane, though the men had stopped using it long before this day. To them, she was just baggage, a woman who'd seen too much, a voice they couldn't allow to carry truth into another town. She remembered the sound of their boots in the dirt, the reek of whiskey on their breath, the cruel grin on Mason Carter's face, the one who had ordered her tied here. Mason, with his black hat tilted low and his words soaked in venom, had spat on the ground before riding away. "Buzzards'll finish what we started," he'd said, "and the desert'll do the rest." The others laughed, but Clara never forgot the hesitation in one pair of eyes, Eli, the youngest of them. His gaze lingered on her longer than the others. For a breath she thought he might cut the ropes. But then Mason's shadow fell across him, and Eli turned his horse, following the gang into the rising dust. Alone now, Clara felt the desert silence press against her ears. It was not empty silence. It was full of cicadas buzzing, vultures circling far above, and the low hum of the wind moving over stone. She had grown up around land like this, and she knew its language. The desert didn't forgive, but it taught, and it never lied. The cactus needles bit deeper as she shifted her weight, trying to ease the rawhide from cutting bone. Blood trickled from her shoulder where a thorn had pierced clean through. Every small movement brought a sting, but she welcomed the pain. Pain meant she was still alive. Her throat burned already. Last night, when they dragged her from the campfire and bound her here, she'd had one sip of water all day. Now the sun was climbing, and she felt her tongue dry against her teeth. She closed her eyes, willing herself not to think of rivers, of wells, of the cool taste of creek water from her childhood. Instead, she thought of her father. His voice came back to her, not in gentleness, but in warning. He had been a rancher, a man who spoke little, worked hard, and believed the desert shaped people the same way it shaped stone. Harsh edges, no room for softness. "You can't fight the desert," he used to say. "You learn from it or you die by it." Those words anchored her now. She was not ready to die. Not here. Not by their hands. Hours passed. The sun blazed down, and Clara's skin began to blister. She felt her lips split, tasted the salt of her own blood. She wanted to scream, but she wouldn't give them that victory, even if they were too far to hear it now. Her jaw locked, and she forced her body to stillness, saving strength the way a miser saves coins. By midday, shadows were gone, swallowed by the fire overhead. Clara's vision wavered. The desert began to shift in her sight, the sand rippling into shapes, faces, memories. She saw her mother's face once, pale and kind, though her mother had been buried years before. She saw her brother too, running across a sunlit pasture, calling her name. She even thought she saw Eli again, the young outlaw, riding back with a knife to free her. But when she blinked, all of it was gone. Only the cactus, only the thorns, only the pitiless stretch of land. And the vultures, closer now. They circled wide at first, mere dots in the sky. But as the hours dragged on, their wings stretched larger, their cries sharper. They knew her. Chances? They had seen the desert claim bodies before. By late afternoon, Clara's arms were numb, her shoulders screaming from the strain of being pulled taut against the cactus arms. The rawhide had eaten into her flesh so deep she could no longer feel her hands. A lesser soul might have prayed. Clara did not. She didn't believe God watched deserts. Out here, only the land decided, and the land listened to will. And she still had hers. As the sun sank, spilling the horizon in orange fire, Clara made herself a promise. If the desert did not take her, if she found a way to outlast the heat, the thirst, and the thorns, then she would not just live. She would make every one of those men choke on the mistake they'd made. Night finally brought a bitter chill. The desert swung from fire to ice with no mercy in between. Clara shivered against the cactus, her blood crusted where the spines pierced her. Coyotes sang from the distance, their howls carrying across the open land. For a moment, it felt as though the earth itself mourned. But Clara did not mourn. She clenched her jaw, lifted her chin, and whispered into the cold night air, "You should have killed me proper, Mason. You should have buried me deep. 'Cause if I live through this, God help you when I come back." The desert heard her. Foul. The stars, sharp as flint against the black sky, bore witness, and somewhere beyond the ridges of stone and shadow, the wind carried her words farther than she knew, toward those who would one day help her make good on them. The desert was a cruel jailer. By dawn of the second day, Clara's body had become a battlefield. Her skin cracked, her lips split, her arms swollen where the rawhide cut deep. Every breath brought a lance of fire from her ribs as the cactus needles dug further in. She woke not from sleep, but from drifting in and out of blackness. Dreams came and went like heat mirages, her mother's voice calling her home for supper, the sound of her father sharpening a blade on stone, the smell of fresh bread cooling on a ranch windowsill. But the moment she opened her eyes, all that sweetness burned away. The sun rose fast, a golden hammer slamming down from the east. It lit the desert in cruel brilliance, and there was no shade to hide in. Clara turned her head as far as the ropes allowed, but the horizon stretched empty, in all directions. Even the distant mountains mocked her, blue ridges wavering like unreachable promises. Thirst clawed at her throat. She tried to swallow, but her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth like leather. The smell of her own blood, dry against the cactus, only made it worse. The gang hadn't even left her a chance at mercy. Not a drop of water, not a crumb of food. They wanted her gone slow, broken. Clara let her head sag forward. A vulture swooped low, its wings cutting the silence. She felt its shadow crawl across her face. The bird landed a dozen paces away, its bald head jerking in quick, ugly motions. It waited. "So that's it, huh?" she rasped, her voice more dust than sound. "You waiting on me?" The vulture didn't answer, of course. It only inched closer, beak glinting in the morning light. Clara tightened her jaw. Not yet. She remembered something her father had once told her when she was just a girl trailing after him on cattle drives. The desert don't care if... You're strong, Clara. It don't care if you're weak, it only cares if you've got enough fight to outlast it. She had fight, more than Mason Carter ever guessed. By midday, the heat became unbearable. Her skin blistered, her vision wavered. The ground itself seemed to shimmer and twist, shapes forming from the light. Clara blinked and saw riders on the horizon, shadows on horseback, dust trailing behind them. She tried to cry out, but her voice cracked into silence. The riders didn't come closer. They dissolved into the air, nothing but the cruel trick of a mirage. When she opened her eyes again, she saw her brother, Matthew, standing just a few feet away. He was older now than he had been when he died, taller, broader, with the same stubborn tilt of the jaw they both shared. "You're stubborn, Clara," the vision said. His voice was clear, warm. "But stubborn don't mean nothing if you don't move." Tears stung her eyes. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm tied." "Then bleed," the ghost of her brother said, fading like smoke. "Better to bleed free than rot tied." The vision broke her, not into despair, but into decision. Clara twisted her wrists against the rawhide. At first, the effort was nothing but agony. The ropes cut deeper, tearing skin, sending blood dripping down her arms. She ground her teeth and pulled harder. Her world narrowed to one thought: break it or break with it. Hours passed like this. Sun, blood, strain. And then, just as the sky began to soften with the colors of evening, one of the knots shifted. The rawhide slipped against her blood-slicked skin. Hope surged. She yanked again, ignoring the scream of her muscles, the fire in her shoulders. And finally, with one brutal twist, her right wrist tore free. The sudden release nearly pitched her to the ground, but the cactus spines held her upright. She bit back a cry as more thorns pierced her. Her left hand was still bound, but she could move now. She could fight. She clawed at the second knot with trembling fingers. Her nails tore, her skin split, but she didn't stop. And when the rawhide finally snapped loose, Clara stumbled forward, falling to her knees in the dust. The vulture, startled, flapped away with a furious cry. Clara stayed on her hands and knees, chest heaving, vision swimming. She was free. But freedom in the desert was no salvation. It was only the beginning of another kind of trial. The night came cold again. She crawled a few yards from the cactus and collapsed beneath a rock outcrop, her body shivering uncontrollably. Coyotes howled in the distance, and she knew she was too weak to fight if they came close. But as she lay there, broken and bleeding, Clara whispered the same vow she had made the night before. "I ain't dying here. Not for them. Not like this." The desert, dark and endless around her, seemed to listen, and in the morning it would give her a path forward, or bury her where she lay. The desert floor was no kinder than the cactus. Clara's knees sank into hot sand, her palms raw from thorns and rope burn, every inch of her body crying out to collapse. She wanted nothing more than to close her eyes and let the earth cover her, but the vow she had carved into her heart kept her moving. Not here, not yet. She rose on shaking legs and stumbled forward. The horizon wavered under the sun, a painted line of false hope, but she fixed her gaze on it anyway. One step, then another. Her boots dragged furrows in the dust. Each breath scraped her throat like broken glass. By midday, the heat bore down with savage cruelty. The desert seemed alive, hissing with cicadas, whispering promises of relief that never came. Clara's vision blurred again, shapes twisting in the distance. She thought she saw a river, glinting like silver. She staggered toward it, only to fall face first into sand. The grit filled her mouth, dry and bitter. She spat, coughing, her whole body convulsing. She stayed there for a long time, cheek pressed to the earth until the ground began to tremble beneath her ear. Hoofbeats. She rolled onto her back, eyes straining against the sunlight. A rider crested a ridge far away, dark silhouette, horse kicking up dust. For a moment, hope surged hot and dangerous inside her chest. She tried to push herself up, but her arms shook too violently. She waved weakly, croaking out a sound that wasn't even a word. The rider slowed, turned, and vanished the other way. Whether it was another mirage or a man of flesh and blood, Clara couldn't tell. All she knew was that no help was coming. She crawled on. The desert night met her like ice water. The same land that blistered her by day froze her to the bone by dusk. She wrapped her arms around herself and lay curled against a rock, teeth chattering. The coyotes came closer that night. She heard their paws skittering in the dark, their low growls carried on the wind. When one padded into the circle of starlight near her, Clara's heart hammered. The animal's eyes glowed pale, hungry. It stepped forward, lips curled back over sharp teeth. Clara's hand brushed the ground beside her. Her fingers closed on a jagged stone. With what little strength she had, she hurled it. The rock clipped the coyote's flank. It yelped and scattered, the others scattering with it. She slumped back, shaking. "That's right," she whispered hoarsely. "I'm not meat, not yet." By the third morning, Clara's body was nothing but wounds stitched together by stubbornness. Her lips bled when she tried to lick them. She staggered forward, every step a miracle. She found prickly pears growing low to the ground, their red fruit swollen with juice. She tore one open with trembling hands, not caring about the spines that tore her fingers. The taste was bittersweet, watery enough to ease her thirst for the first time in days. The fruit gave her strength. Not much, but enough. She followed. The land, trusting her instincts, scanning for any sign of shade, of water, of life beyond vultures. And finally, just before dusk, she heard it. A faint trickle. Her heart leapt as she staggered toward the sound. Over a ridge, tucked in a stony hollow, a thin ribbon of water spilled from a crack in the rock. It wasn't much, barely more than a trickle into a shallow pool, but to Clara it was salvation. She fell to her knees and pressed her face to the water. It was warm, filled with grit, but it wet her tongue, cooled her throat, eased the fire that had burned her insides raw. She drank until her stomach cramped, then lay back in the dust, tears streaming down her temples. The stars blinked awake above her, cold and sharp. Clara stared up at them, whispering through her cracked lips, You didn't take me, not yet. But she knew this was only a reprieve. Water might keep her alive another day, maybe two. She was still alone, still broken, still deep in land where only the strongest walked out. Somewhere out there, Mason Carter and his men were laughing, drinking, certain she was bones by now. Clara clenched her fists. I'll crawl through fire if I have to, but I'll make it back. The desert listened, and for the first time, it gave her something back, the faint glow of a campfire far across the sands. Not a mirage this time, real, and with it, the first sign that her fate might be about to change. The campfire flickered faint against the black desert sky. Clara thought at first her mind was playing tricks again, another cruel mirage born of thirst and exhaustion, but when she blinked, the glow held steady, pulsing warm against the horizon. Her heart thudded. Fire meant people. People meant either salvation or danger. She staggered to her feet, knees threatening to buckle. Each step was a battle, her boots dragging, her breath ragged in the cold air. The desert at night had no mercy. The stars were sharp, the wind slicing, every grain of sand crunching like broken glass beneath her weight. She whispered to herself with each step, a rhythm to keep moving. One more, one more, one more. The glow grew brighter. Her vision swam, shapes forming beyond the firelight, silhouettes, tall and still. Not outlaws, not the ranchers she once knew. These figures moved differently with a quiet weight, as if the desert itself flowed around them. Clara stumbled forward into the circle of firelight and collapsed. The world tilted. She heard voices low and sharp, speaking words she couldn't understand. Feet shifted in the sand around her. A hand turned her onto her back. Dark faces loomed above, eyes reflecting firelight, hair long and tied back. The language carried strength and suspicion, clipped and swift. Clara tried to lift her head. Please. The word rasped out of her cracked throat. Don't leave me. The figures exchanged looks. One knelt close, his eyes narrow and steady. He touched her wrists, saw the rawhide burns, the blood-crusted cuts. He spoke again in his tongue. Another brought water in a gourd and tipped it gently to her lips. The liquid was lukewarm, earthy, but it was life itself. Clara drank greedily until the hand pulled it away. More, she croaked. The warrior shook his head, speaking in words she didn't know. He gave her another small swallow, then drew back. Clara's vision blurred again. She caught only glimpses, the flicker of painted shields propped against rocks, the glint of weapons, the sharp faces of men and women watching her with equal parts caution and curiosity. Then blackness swallowed her. She woke to morning light. The sun had just cleared the ridges, its rays gilding the desert with harsh brilliance, but she was not on the sand anymore. She lay beneath a lean-to of brush, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of smoke and sage. For a long moment she thought, she must be dead dreaming. Then the ache in her body reminded her otherwise. She shifted, wincing as every wound made itself known. Voices murmured nearby. Clara turned her head and saw them. A small band of Apache warriors, perhaps a dozen in all. They moved with quiet precision, some tending to horses, others sharpening. Blades, two young ones carrying wood for the fire. The one who had given her water the night before noticed she was awake. He approached slowly, kneeling beside her. His face was lean, lined with sun and wind, his eyes unreadable. "Huyotai's not dead," he said in rough English. Clara blinked at him. Her lips parted but no words came. He studied her a moment longer, then pointed to the scars on her wrists. "Tied," she nodded weakly. "Left. To die." His jaw tightened. He stood and called to the others. They gathered, a circle of faces watching her. One of the older men spoke sharply, his tone edged with mistrust. The one who had knelt, perhaps younger than the rest, though his bearing was firm, answered him, gesturing to Clara. They argued in low tones for several minutes. Clara could only watch, her heart hammering. She knew enough to understand she was being weighed, whether to be left, killed, or spared. Finally, the younger man crouched again beside her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, not unkind but not soft either. "You live," "But you prove," he said. "Not weak." Clara swallowed. Her voice cracked, but her eyes held steady. "I'll prove, whatever it takes." Something flickered in his gaze, the faintest glimmer of respect. He stood and said a word to the others. The circle broke, the warriors moving back to their tasks. Clara sank into the blanket, her body trembling. Relief flooded her, though she knew it was not salvation. Not yet. She was alive only by their choice, and that choice could change with the wind. But for the first time since Mason Carter left her to die, she was not alone. And somewhere deep inside, she felt the first stirrings of something dangerous, something the desert itself seemed to whisper in her ear, "This is not the end, this is the beginning." The Apache did not trust her. Clara saw it in every glance, in the way their hands lingered near their weapons, in the way no one turned their back fully to her. To them, she was not kin. She was not ally. She was a stranger dragged half dead from the sand, a burden at best, a danger at worst. And the desert had no room for burdens. By the second morning in their camp, the one who had given her water, his name, she learned, was Taji, stood over her as she struggled to rise from the blanket. His eyes, dark as volcanic glass, studied her without pity. "You walk," he said in his clipped English. Clara tried to stand, her legs buckling beneath her weight. Pain seared her raw wrists, her cracked lips. She bit back a cry. Taji did not move to help her. His gaze was hard, but not cruel. It was the look of someone waiting to see if a fire would catch or burn out. So Clara pushed. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself upright. Her knees shook, but she stayed on her feet. The older warriors watched in silence. One, his hair streaked silver, muttered something in Apache. Taji answered curtly, never taking his eyes off her. Clara straightened her back, though her body screamed. "I'm not weak," she rasped. "Not anymore." Taji's mouth twitched, whether in amusement or approval, she couldn't tell. He turned and gestured for her to follow. They led her, out into the desert that morning, away from the camp. The sun was already rising, promising another day of merciless heat. Clara staggered after them, each step a fight, but pride and stubbornness forced her forward. They stopped at a dry arroyo, where thorn bushes clawed at the edges of stone. Taji handed her a sharpened stick and pointed to the earth. "You dig," he said. "Find water." Clara blinked at him. "There's nothing here." He tilted, his head. "If you say nothing, you die." The others chuckled lowly, watching. Clara dropped to her knees. Her hands trembled as she stabbed the stick into the packed earth, scraping, gouging, clawing at the dirt. Hours passed. Her nails split, her palms bled. The warriors waited in silence, their shadows growing long. When her strength began to falter, Clara heard her brother's voice again in memory. "Bleed if you must. Better to bleed free than rot tied." She jammed the stick into the ground one last time, and the soil gave. A dark patch of dampness spread in the dirt. Clara fell forward, scooping handfuls of mud, sucking the moisture like it was salvation. Taji crouched, pressed his hand to the damp earth and nodded once. He said something to the others. The laughter ceased. That night, Clara was given a place near the fire, not inside their circle, but close enough to feel its warmth. She was given food, roasted rabbit, tough and gamey, but better than roots and cactus fruit. She ate in silence, every bite burning her cracked lips, but she did not complain. The silver-haired elder studied her across the flames. His voice, deep and measured, carried weight when he spoke. Taji translated. "He says, 'Desert tried to kill you. You still here. That means something.'" Clara met the elder's gaze. "The desert doesn't take me," she said hoarsely. "It trains me." The words hung in the night air. Some of the warriors smirked, a few nodded. Taji's eyes flickered with the faintest gleam of approval. For the first time since she'd been left tied to that cactus, Clara felt something stir in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but belonging. The sense that perhaps she had stumbled not into strangers, but into a fire that might forge her into something stronger. She lay under the stars that night, wrapped in the smoke of the fire, and whispered to herself, "Mason Carter, you left me for dead. You thought the desert would finish me, but the desert just gave me an army." The coyotes howled in the distance, and Clara smiled through the pain. At dawn, Clara woke to the sound of chanting. Low voices moved like the rhythm of hoofbeats, steady and unyielding. She opened her eyes and saw the Apache men gathered at the edge of camp, painting their faces with red and black streaks, sharpening blades that caught the morning light. Taji stood over her, tossing a strip of dried meat at her feet. "Eat," he said simply. Clara chewed the tough sinew until her jaw ached, then rose, dust clinging to her dress. She had no weapon, no horse, no place among them, but Taji gestured for her to follow. She did. They led her into a canyon where the sun barely reached the bottom, shadows pooling like deep water. A handful of young Apache men trained there, moving silently, their feet finding stone ledges without slipping, their bodies flowing like wind through brush. Taji pointed at Clara. "You learn," he said. The first lesson was silence. She stumbled across rocks that clattered under her boots, snagged her skirt on thorns, and cursed when sharp stone cut her ankle. The men laughed quietly, like coyotes, mocking prey. Clara gritted her teeth. Taji corrected her stance, guiding her to place her feet softer, roll her weight on the balls rather than heels. Hours passed, her body battered by falls and scrapes. But by the time the sun was high, she moved quieter. Not like them, not yet, but less like the clumsy girl who had once relied on town streets and wagons. The second lesson was endurance. They ran her until her lungs burned. She stumbled through dry washes over ridges, across thorn flats that tore her skin raw. The others loped like deer, tireless, laughing at her struggle. When she collapsed, Taji threw a water skin at her and said, "Again." Something inside her snarled. Clara pushed up, legs trembling, and ran until the desert blurred. Her vision narrowed to the sound of her heartbeat, to the grit between her teeth, to the memory of Mason Carter's voice the night he betrayed her. "Run, Clara. Run until the desert keeps you." But the desert hadn't kept her, and she would not let it. By nightfall, she stumbled into camp half dead, her body trembling with exhaustion. Yet when they passed her food, she ate without complaint. Not a single word of surrender crossed her lips. The third lesson was pain. Taji handed her a bow. The wood was smooth, the string taut. He gestured toward a cactus spine set upright in the sand. "Hit it." Clara laughed bitterly. "With what?" He dropped 3 arrows at her feet. Her hands fumbled. The string bit her fingers. The arrow fell clumsy from the bow. The others snorted. Clara's face burned, but she tried again. The string snapped against her arm, leaving a welt. The arrow missed by yards. "You fight," one of the young warriors mocked in broken English. "You fight like baby deer." Clara's jaw clenched. She knocked again, sweat stinging her eyes. The bowstring screamed as she pulled it back. Her arms shook, she loosed. The arrow struck the sand a foot from the cactus spine. The men laughed again, but Taji raised his hand. "Closer," he said. Clara stared at the bow in her hands. Blood, dripping from the welt on her forearm. Something hardened in her chest. She would not be laughed at, she would not fail. She drew again, ignoring the pain. This time, the arrow buried itself in the cactus flesh, quivering in place. The laughter stopped. Taji's lips curved almost imperceptibly. "Again," he said. Night after night, Clara trained. Her hands blistered on the bow, her legs bled from running, her body shook from exhaustion. But every day she woke again, and every day she endured. The elder, the one with silver in his hair, began to watch her closely. Once he offered her a carved piece of obsidian tied with sinew, a small blade more symbol than weapon. Taji translated, "He says, the desert does not waste. If it leaves you alive, then you are meant to be sharpened." Clara took the sinew blade, her fingers curling tight around it. She whispered more to herself than them. "They thought leaving me tied to a cactus would kill me. Instead, it's making me stronger." The firelight flickered in her eyes. The warband saw it too. She was no longer just a stray. She was becoming one of them. The desert had no mercy, but it had lessons for those stubborn enough to listen. Clara was beginning to hear them. Days blurred into one another, hot winds, dust in her teeth, muscles screaming with every breath. Yet her body no longer collapsed, as it once did. She rose with the dawn, ate little, drank less, and still found a strength that hadn't lived in her before. Now came the lesson of shadows. Taji led her into the hills, where the land broke into jagged spires and shallow caves. He crouched low, motioning for her to follow. The warband moved like smoke, blending into stone and brush. Clara's every step seemed too loud, too clumsy. "See without being seen," Taji murmured. At first she saw nothing, just rocks and sand, heat waves bending the horizon. Then she caught it, movement that wasn't wind. An Apache warrior crouched beneath, a mesquite tree still as death. Another lay half-buried in the sand, his bow already drawn. Her heart thudded. They had been there all along, watching. Taji gestured at her, then at the canyon below, where a small band of wild horses drank from a cracked pool. "Approach," he said. Clara swallowed. She dropped low, moving step by step. Every stone seemed ready to betray her. The horses raised their heads, ears flicking. One stamped the ground. Clara froze, hardly daring to breathe. Then she slid forward again, softer this time, just as Taji had taught her, with her feet rolling gently over earth instead of stomping. She got within a dozen yards before the herd bolted, hooves thundering like distant drums. When she turned back, the warriors were watching, their faces unreadable. Taji gave a single nod. Not approval, not yet, but recognition. That night, by the fire, Clara sat apart, her bow across her lap. Her fingers still blistered, her arms sore, but her arrows now struck closer to the mark. The elder, who rarely spoke to her, began humming a chant, low, deep, like the heartbeat of the land itself. One by one the men joined in. Taji translated quietly. "It is a song of the unseen hunter. It says, 'The earth holds you, the sky hides you, the prey never knows you are there until the arrow sings.'" Clara closed her eyes and let the chant wash over her. She thought of Mason Carter, of the men who had tied her to that cactus. They hadn't seen her as a threat. They hadn't thought she would survive. A bitter smile curved her lips. One day soon they would not see her coming either. The next test came at dawn. The warband led her toward a trading trail, narrow, winding, carved by wagons and greed. Taji crouched beside her, pointing at the distant line of riders. Mexican traders, 4 of them, with mules and heavy packs. "Not kill," he told her. "Watch, learn." The Apache slipped into the earth itself. Clara pressed herself against stone, holding her breath. The riders passed within arm's reach, yet none turned their heads. She could see the sweat dripping down one man's neck, the dust on their boots, the nervous flick of their eyes. They felt watched, though they could not see. Then, as suddenly as the shadow formed, the warband melted away. No sound, no trace. Only Clara remained, her heart hammering with the thrill of invisibility. When they regrouped, Taji's voice was low but firm. "Now you begin to belong." Clara gripped her bow tighter. For the first time since the cactus, she believed it. That evening she spoke. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. "They left me tied to die," she said, her voice steady though her chest ached. "The man who did it was Mason Carter. He was the one I trusted most. He took everything. My father's land, my future, and nearly my life." The fire popped. The warband listened in silence. Taji's eyes narrowed. "And you will take it back?" Clara's gaze burned like the embers. "Not just back. I'll make them choke on what they tried to bury." A slow murmur rippled through the warriors. It was not laughter this time, it was respect. The elder lifted his hand, drawing lines in the air with his finger. Patterns Clara didn't understand but felt deep in her bones. A blessing, perhaps, or a warning. Either way, she was no longer an outsider. The desert had not killed her. It was sharpening her into a weapon. The night smelled of smoke and iron. The warband moved without words, their bodies flowing through shadow like they belonged to the desert itself. Clara followed, heart hammering, her bow gripped tight though. Her hands still trembled. They had tracked the riders all day. 4 cattle thieves who had crossed Apache land without respect. cutting down sacred brush for their fire, stealing from waterholes already claimed by another people. To the Apache, that was an insult worthy of blood. To Clara, it was a chance to prove herself. They waited on the ridge above the thieves' camp. The men below laughed too loudly, their bottles clinking, the fire crackling in careless sparks. Their horses shifted uneasily, sensing what the drunk men did not. Taji crouched beside her. His whisper was softer than sand on stone. "Tonight, you learn." Clara swallowed hard. Her mouth was dry, but not from fear alone. This was the line she had known would come, the line between surviving and killing. She thought of Mason Carter's smile as he left her tied, the flies gathering already on her bleeding skin. She thought of the heat, the thirst, the way death had pressed its hand against her throat, and she knew she could do this. The first arrow flew not from her but from an elder. It hissed through the night, striking a man square in the chest. He fell back with a broken gasp, the bottle in his hand shattering on the rocks. Chaos. Another. Warrior was already on his feet, spear thrusting down through a throat before the man could scream. The thieves scrambled for guns, but the Apaches were faster, shadows cutting through firelight. Clara's bowstring quivered beneath her fingers. She drew, the arrowhead glinting faintly. Her chest burned with the effort, with the fear. A man stumbled into her line of sight, reeling, his pistol half raised. She let the arrow go. It struck him in the side, sinking deep. He cried out, dropped his pistol, and crumpled into the dust. Clara froze. The sound of it, the raw, mortal sound, rang, in her ears louder than gunfire. Her stomach lurched. She had put an end to a man's breath. Taji's hand pressed firm on her shoulder. "Good." His voice was steady, not cruel. "Now you are one of us." When it was over, the fire still burned, but no laughter rose from it. The thieves lay scattered in the dirt, their eyes glassy and mouths slack. Blood darkened the sand, rich and hot. Clara knelt beside the man she had shot. Her hands shook as she reached out, not to help him, but to see. His chest no longer rose. He was gone, carried into silence. For a moment, guilt stabbed her, sharp and cold. But behind it came something else. Not pride, not joy, but a grim understanding. Life out here demanded payment, and sometimes that payment was in blood. The others moved quickly, gathering what could be used. Guns, ammunition, food. Nothing was wasted. The warband lived by necessity, not cruelty. When they were done, the elder looked at her across the firelight. His gaze was heavy, but not unkind. "You bleed with us now," he said through Taji's translation. "The desert has claimed you. The war has claimed you." Clara rose, wiping her bloody hands against her torn skirt. She felt sick, hollow, but also sharper, stronger. Mason Carter had wanted her to die nameless on the Cactus. Instead, she was being reborn with a bow in her hand and fire in her chest. For the first time, Clara looked at the warband not as saviors, but as family. And she silently vowed, when the day came to face Carter and his men, she would not flinch. Not again. The desert woke Clara early, as it always did. The air was sharp with cold, her breath misting in faint streams before the sun burned it away. She rose with the warband, her bow slung across her back, and followed them into the day's hunt, not for food this time, but for knowledge. Taji had told her the night before, it is not enough to shoot straight. To live, you must think. She didn't fully understand then. She would by sunset. They moved across the mesas, studying trails. To Clara, at first, it was dust and rocks, but the warband saw patterns everywhere. Hoofprints pressed shallow in dry soil, broken brush where horses had pushed through, the faint scatter of dung. That told not just where cattle had passed, but how fast and how long ago. The elder crouched low, pointing to the sand. A line of ants moved across it, carrying crumbs in patient order. He spoke, and Taji translated, "Watch the small, and you will know the large. Ants know where food is. Coyotes know where water hides. Men are no different." Clara listened, watched, tried to see with new eyes. Slowly the desert unfolded its language to her. By midday, they had followed a trail to a dry riverbed where boot prints crisscrossed, the thieves from last. Night had allies, more riders, perhaps 10, maybe 12, moving north. They had left signs of carelessness, discarded bones from a meal, a whiskey cork half buried in sand. Clara crouched beside the tracks. Her pulse quickened. She imagined Mason Carter's boots here, his men with him. She tasted the old bitterness on her tongue. "Patience," Taji said quietly. "Revenge is a fire. If you feed it too fast, it burns you first." That evening, around the fire, the lessons deepened. The warriors used stones and sticks to mark the earth, showing her how ambushes worked, how wind carried sound, how moonlight betrayed movement, how shadows could be friend or enemy depending on where one stood. Clara leaned close, absorbing it all. For the first time in weeks, her mind felt sharper than her grief. "Out here," Taji said, moving a stick across the dirt map. "Numbers matter less than ground. A high ridge can turn 5 men into 50. A narrow canyon can swallow the strong." Clara nodded, her gaze fixed. She thought of Carter's gang, always riding bold and loud, never watching the land they traveled. They relied on fear and bullets. She was learning a different kind of power, quiet, patient, rooted in the bones of the desert. The next trial came unannounced. Near dawn, as they moved camp, a scout returned with urgency in his eyes. Through Taji's hurried translation, Clara understood. Riders were approaching. Not settlers, not traders. Men with rifles. Carters. Colors on their bandanas. The warband did not panic. Instead, they melted into the stones and scrub, vanishing as if the earth itself had swallowed them. Clara followed, her heart racing. From the ridge, she watched them come, 6 riders laughing, guns loose in their hands. They stopped at the warband's old camp, poking through ashes, finding little but footprints and embers. Clara's bowstring was warm against her palm. She wanted to draw, to strike now. But the elder raised his hand and the band waited, silent as hawks. The riders searched, cursed, and finally rode on, leaving dust in their wake. Clara exhaled only when they were gone. Her chest ached with held breath. She turned to Taji. "Why not attack? We had them." Taji's eyes were calm. "And tomorrow 20 more would come looking. Victory is not in the body you drop, but in the war you win." The words sank into her like water into dry roots. She understood then that vengeance would not be one night of blood. It would be a campaign. A war. That night, Clara sat apart from the fire, sharpening her arrows. She thought of Mason Carter, of the men who left her to die, of the cactus needles still lodged faintly under her skin. She no longer dreamed of rushing in, gun blazing. She dreamed of patience, of traps, of Carter's face when he realized the desert itself had turned against him. The warband had taught her the first rule of survival. Now they were teaching her the first rule of victory. The desert whispered to Clara that night. The wind dragged long across the canyon, carrying with it the smell of smoke. Not from there, fire, but from the east. Someone else was camped nearby, someone careless. The scouts confirmed it before dawn. 3 men, riders, sleeping beside their tethered horses. They bore the colors of Carter's gang, their laughter echoing faintly in the stillness. Clara's chest tightened. Here it was, the first chance. The elder studied her across the embers of the warband's fire. His dark eyes asked the question without words. "Are you ready to decide?" Clara nodded once. "We take them." The plan was simple but not easy. Clara remembered Taji's lessons: ground, shadow, silence. She moved with the others through the rocks, her bow in hand, the desert cool against her skin. From the ridge above she saw the camp. The men were sprawled in sleep, boots still on, pistols within reach. Their horses shifted nervously, ears twitching. Clara's pulse throbbed in her ears. Every instinct screamed to rush down, to end it fast. But she breathed deep, steadying herself. Not fire. Not rage. Patience. The warband spread into position. 2 crept toward the horses, cutting reins with stone knives. Another circled wide, blocking the path back to the open flats. Clara moved last, slipping down the slope until she was close, enough to see the rise and fall of a chest beneath a filthy shirt. She knocked her arrow and held it steady, waiting for the signal. The elder lifted his hand. For a heartbeat, the desert was perfectly still. Then his fingers dropped. The ambush erupted. A warrior shouted from the ridge, startling the horses into a frenzy. They bolted into the dark, hooves thundering. The riders awoke in chaos, fumbling for weapons. Clara drew, loosed. Her arrow struck one in the shoulder before he could rise. Another spun, pistol half raised, but a lance came from the shadows, driving him back against the rocks. The third staggered upright, cursing, firing wildly into the dark. Clara ducked, heart hammering, then rose again, arrow already drawn. She let it fly, and the man fell hard, gun clattering from his grip. In less than a minute it was over. The sow. Warband stood in silence, the three men still at their feet. Clara's hands shook, but not from fear this time, from something sharper, hotter. She had chosen. She had led. Taji approached, her face unreadable. You moved well. You listened. Clara's gaze lingered on the fallen. They were Carter's. Yes, Taji said softly. And more will come when they do not return. That is the way of war. Clara nodded. She wasn't afraid of that truth anymore. In fact, she welcomed it. Every rider they sent, every trail they followed, would bring her closer to Carter himself. Before dawn they stripped the camp. Guns, cartridges, water, anything of use. Clara strapped a Colt revolver to her hip, its weight both foreign and familiar. As the sun rose, painting the desert in fire, the warband melted back into the canyons. Clara glanced once over her shoulder at the bodies left in the sand. She thought of the cactus where she'd been tied, the men who laughed as they rode away. You'll hear of me now, she thought. Every gun, every arrow, every shadow. The desert is mine. I am coming for you. The warband did not question her anymore. She was no longer just a survivor among them. She was becoming something else, a leader, a hunter, and Mason Carter's reckoning. Mason Carter leaned back in his chair, boots on the table, a cigar clenched between his teeth. The saloon was thick with smoke, laughter, and the smell of spilled whiskey, but Carter's grin didn't reach his eyes. A rider had just arrived, dusty and trembling, with a story Carter didn't much care for. They ain't back, the man stammered. Frank, Ellis, and Red. They was supposed to ride through by yesterday, but I found the horses. Spooked, running free, saddles still on 'em, blood on the reins. The saloon quieted, the card game at the next table forgotten. Carter sat up slow, smoke curling around his head. You saying someone jumped him? The rider nodded, swallowing hard. Carter's jaw worked as he chewed the end of his cigar. His gang had enemies, ranchers, miners, even a few lawmen too stubborn to look the other way. But none had dared strike so close, so clean. Tracks? He asked. Couldn't follow long. Vanished into the rocks. Carter flicked ash onto the floor, his mind grinding. 3 men gone without so much as a gunshot heard in town. Horses taken, supplies stripped. That wasn't chance. That was deliberate. Meanwhile, far from the saloon, Clara listened to the coyotes calling in the night. She sat with the warband in the fire's glow, her new revolver heavy at her side. The first raid had been only a beginning, but it was enough. Enough to let Carter know the desert wasn't his alone. Enough to rattle the chains of fear that bound the townsfolk to his shadow, and enough to whisper her name into the dust. The warriors spoke of her now with nods of respect. Not as the girl tied to the cactus, but as the one who struck back. They had seen her steady hand, her patience, her will. Taji sat across from her, sharpening her blade. Word will travel, she said quietly. It always does. Clara met her gaze. Good. Let him hear it. Back in the saloon, Carter poured himself a shot of whiskey and downed it in one swallow. His men watched him, shifting uneasily. You know what I think, Carter said, voice low and dangerous. I think someone out there got bold. Maybe a rancher thinks he can play hero. Maybe the Comanche want to remind us whose land this is. Doesn't matter which. He slammed the glass down hard enough to crack it. Whoever it is, he growled. They don't know who they're dealing with. We'll smoke 'em out. Burn every canyon if we have to. But as he spoke, a memory flickered, sunlight blazing, a woman's face contorted with fury, the way her voice carried across the desert as they left her tied to that cactus. "You'll pay for this, Carter." He had laughed then. But now the words slid back like a knife between his ribs. No, it wasn't possible. She couldn't have lived. Could she? Clara's eyes burned with the reflection of the fire. She didn't know exactly how the whispers reached him, but she felt it in her bones. Mason Carter would hear soon, and when he did, his empire of fear would begin to crack. The desert hadn't killed her, it had forged her, and now every shadow, every canyon, every rider who rode with her name on their lips was another weapon aimed at him. For the first time in years, Mason Carter didn't sleep easy that night, and for the first time in her life, Clara did. The Warband moved at dawn, when the desert sky still held the cool hush of night. Clara rode near the front, her eyes narrowed against the horizon. They had scouted Carter's movements for weeks now, following his riders, watching his supply trains snake through the desert from one stolen ranch to another. Those trains were the lifeblood of Carter's empire. Stolen cattle, wagons of grain, barrels of whiskey bound for bribes, bullets, and power. Without them, his gang would starve. His hold over the town would loosen. Clara knew this, and so did Taji. "Cut the vein," Taji had said simply. "The body weakens." The ambush came in a dry gulch, narrow and shadowed, with steep walls rising like jagged teeth. Carter's men drove 3 wagons through, loaded with supplies, escorted by 6 riders with rifles slung. They laughed as they rode, unaware the rocks above watched them with sharpened eyes. Clara lay belly down on the ridge, her rifle steady, her heart hammering. The desert wind carried the faint creak of wheels, the lowing of cattle. She glanced at the warriors beside her, silent, ready, waiting. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The crack of her shot split the morning stillness, echoing down the gulch. The lead rider toppled from his horse before he even knew he was dead. Chaos erupted below. Arrows hissed from the rocks. Another man fell, clutching his throat. Horses reared, wagons lurched. Carter's men shouted, trying to return fire, but the canyon walls trapped them in a storm of bullets and stone. Clara rose to her knees, firing again. A rider wheeled his horse, trying to charge out, but she put a bullet clean through his chest. The battle was over in minutes. Dust settled. Horses, riderless, scattered into the desert. Supplies lay abandoned in the wreckage of wagons. The warriors moved quickly, cutting loose sacks of grain, barrels of water, crates of ammunition. Clara joined them, her hands trembling with the rush of victory. They hadn't just won. They had struck a blow Carter couldn't ignore. By noon, smoke rose in the distance where Carter's men burned their dead. In town, whispers grew louder. Wagons gone, riders dead. The mighty Mason Carter, bleeding in the desert. In the saloon, Carter slammed his fist on the bar hard enough to send glasses tumbling. "Supplies don't just disappear," he barked. "Someone's out there hitting us, and I want to know who." But his men avoided his eyes, muttering, restless. Fear was a poison, and it was spreading fast. One of his lieutenants finally spoke. "Boss, they say it's her." Carter froze. "Who?" "The girl. The one you left." Laughter broke from his throat, sharp and bitter. Dead women don't lead ambushes. Yet even as he said it, his hand trembled as he poured another drink. That night, Clara sat by the fire, staring into the flames. She could feel the tide shifting. Carter would know now. He would feel it in his bones, that the desert had turned against him. But she also knew what came next. He wouldn't sit idle. He would strike back harder, meaner. The war had begun, and this time she wasn't alone. The attack came at night. Clara had grown used to the desert's silence, the steady rhythm of crickets and wind through mesquite. But that night, the air shifted. Horses thundered in the dark. Then came the roar of gunfire. Bullets tore through. Tense, sparks lit canvas. Within seconds, the camp was chaos. Clara dove for her rifle, rolling out into the open as flames climbed skyward. Carter's riders had come hard and fast, whooping like devils, rifles blazing. They rode in a circle, spitting lead, setting fire to whatever their torches touched. "Cover the women and children," Tazi shouted, his voice cutting through the panic. Clara returned fire, her heart pounding. She dropped one rider, then another, but there were too many. Carter had sent a small army, dozens of men hungry for revenge. The desert lit up with hellfire. Warriors fought back, loosing arrows that streaked red in the glow of flames. Horses screamed, men cursed. The night became a blur of smoke and blood. Clara spotted him then, Carter himself, sitting tall in the saddle, silhouetted by fire. His wide-brimmed hat cast his face in shadow, but she could feel his gaze lock on her. "You should have stayed dead, girl," he bellowed, raising his pistol. She fired at him, but he wheeled his horse, vanishing into the smoke. By the time the raiders pulled away, half the camp was gone to ash. The survivors dragged the wounded into what shelter they could find. Clara stumbled among them, her rifle heavy in her hands. She froze when she saw Little Crow. The boy lay still by the fire pit, an arrow shaft broken in his chest. His wide eyes stared at the stars, unblinking. "No," Clara whispered, falling to her knees. She pressed her hands against the wound, though she knew it was too late. Blood had already soaked deep into the earth. Around her, voices rose in grief. "Mothers," cried. Warriors sat in silence, their faces carved from stone. The Warband had lost many that night, and Clara felt each death as though Carter's bullets had torn through her own skin. When dawn came, the survivors gathered what they could. Burnt wagons, broken bows, ashes where laughter once lived. Clara stood before them, her clothes singed, her face streaked with soot and tears. "This is what he brings," she said, her voice raw. "Fire, death, he thinks he can break us with fear." Her hand tightened on her rifle. "But he's wrong. We will not scatter. We will not bow. We'll hit him harder. We'll make him bleed for every life he's taken." Taji placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression grim but steady. "Then we strike again. Not from the shadows this time. We make him see us." Clara nodded, though her chest ached. She felt the weight of Little Crow's empty eyes, the weight of every grave the desert now held. This was no longer just about her survival. It was war. And for the first time, Mason Carter feared the war was one he could not win. The desert still smelled of smoke. Clara hadn't slept since the attack. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Little Crow's face, still pale, eyes reflecting starlight that would never reach him again. But grief in the desert could not be carried long. It turned heavy, then sharp. Clara sharpened it into a blade. At dawn she walked among the warriors, studying the burned wagons, the blood-stained earth. The warband was quieter now, fewer voices, fewer hearts beating. But those who remained carried a fire in their eyes. "We can't wait for him to strike again," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "If we stay still, Carter will circle back and finish us." Taji nodded. "So where do we bleed him?" Clara lifted her chin toward the red cliffs rising beyond the horizon. "The canyon. He'll ride through it with his men when he returns. North. It's narrow with high ridges. We'll choke him in there. End him where he can't run." The warriors murmured. Some looked doubtful. Others grinned grimly. One elder spat into the dirt. "He brings fire. Let us give him stone." For 3 days they worked. They hauled boulders high onto the ridges, hidden from the canyon floor below. Warriors set deadfalls with ropes and pulleys, ready to crush riders when they passed. Clara studied the choke point, marking places for riflemen, for archers, for the young warriors who could slip unseen between shadows. The desert had taught her patience. The warband taught her precision. Every night, Clara whispered a promise to Little Crow. "When he rides through here, he will pay." Carter came on the 4th morning. Dozens of riders, dust rising in great plumes behind them. He looked confident, smug even, unaware of the trap he rode into. Clara crouched on the ridge, rifle in hand, heart steady now. The first riders entered the narrow canyon, their laughter carried upward, careless. Clara gave the signal. With a roar, the warriors cut the ropes. Boulders thundered down the cliffs, smashing into the canyon floor. Horses screamed, men shouted. The raiders broke formation, some trampled in the chaos. Gunfire cracked, but the canyon walls turned it into panic and echo. Arrows whistled from above. Rifles barked. The warriors rained death from every side. Clara picked her targets carefully, one after another. She dropped a rider who tried to rally the men, another who drew a torch. The canyon became a slaughterhouse. And then she saw him, Carter. He was pinned in the chaos, his horse rearing, beneath falling stone. His eyes found hers on the ridge, and for a heartbeat they locked. His face twisted, not in fear, but fury. "Clara!" he roared, his voice rising above the din. He tried to push through the trap, forcing his men forward, but the canyon swallowed them. Blood pooled in the dirt. Bodies fell with every echo of gunfire. By the time the last echoes faded, the canyon floor was a graveyard. Carter was gone. He had slipped away in the smoke and panic. Clara's heart pounded, not with victory but with rage. He had escaped again. She climbed down among the dead, stepping over broken rifles, shattered stone, and the twisted wreckage of Carter's warband. Tazi approached her, his hands bloody, his eyes grim. "We broke him," he said. "His men are fewer now, his strength weakens." Clara shook her head. Her gaze swept the canyon, but it was already clear. Carter had vanished into the desert once more. "We hurt him," she said softly, gripping her rifle until her knuckles whitened. "But until he's gone, there will be no peace." Her war wasn't finished. It had only sharpened. The desert was silent after the trap. The canyon still, reeked of gunpowder and blood, but Carter was not among the dead. His shadow lingered in Clara's mind like a thorn too deep to pull free. She knew he wouldn't run far. Men like him didn't disappear into the desert. They struck back, and so she waited. For 3 nights the warband tracked him through arroyos and red mesas, following hoofprints, scraps of burned cloth, the occasional blood trail. His men were shattered, scattered across the desert like broken glass. But Carter pressed on, relentless. As a wolf with its teeth still bared, Clara barely slept. Her thoughts returned again and again to the night he tied her to the cactus. She remembered the bite of rope in her wrists, the sting of the thorns, the laughter as they left her for dead. And she remembered the desert's whisper, "Endure. Rise. Become." By dawn on the 4th day they found him. Carter stood in a dry wash, what remained of his riders gathered around him. They looked ragged, hollow-eyed, their strength spent. But Carter's eyes still burned like coals. When he saw Clara at the head of the warband, he smiled. "Well, look at you," he said, his voice carrying across the sand. "Thought you'd be bones bleaching under the sun. But here you are, a queen of savages." Clara raised her rifle steady. "This ends today." Carter laughed. "You think you've beaten me? Girl, you're nothing but what I made you." The warriors spread wide, surrounding the outlaws. Taji gave a low cry and arrows darkened the air. Gunfire cracked back, echoing off the stone walls. Dust rose, horses screamed. Clara's eyes never left Carter. She broke through the chaos, cutting down 2 of his men as she pushed forward. He fired once, the bullet tearing across her shoulder, but she didn't stop. Blood ran hot down her arm, but the desert had taught her to ignore pain. They met in the center of the wash, where the ground was cracked and white with salt. Carter swung his rifle like a club, smashing it across her face. Clara staggered, but came back, slamming her knife into his side. He grunted, eyes flashing hate, and drove his fist into her gut. They crashed into the dirt, rolling, striking, each blow fueled by years of fury. "Should have died on that cactus," Carter spat, choking her with both hands. His grip was iron, his teeth bared. Clara clawed for air, her vision blurring, the desert spinning around her. She thought of Little Crow, of the warriors who had fallen, of the girl she used to be, the one left to die. She reached for the desert inside her, the strength it had burned into her bones. With a roar she wrenched free, grabbed a shard of stone from the ground, and drove it deep into his throat. Carter's eyes went wide. He stumbled back, blood pouring, his voice gurgling into silence. Clara rose to her feet, breathing hard, watching as he dropped to his knees. His glare burned at her to the last, but then his body fell into the sand and the desert claimed him. The battlefield stilled. The last of Carter's riders lay scattered, dead or fleeing into the horizon. Clara stood over the man who had once owned her fate, and for the first time she felt the chains break. Tazi approached, silent, his face solemn. "It is done," he said. Clara looked out across the desert, the same land that had nearly killed her, that had scarred her, trained her, hardened her. "No," she whispered. "It's only begun." Because the desert didn't just take, it remade. And now she wasn't just a survivor, she was something more. A war leader. The woman the desert had forged. And as the warband lifted their voices to the sky, Clara knew the frontier would remember her name for generations to come.